I was asked to speak on Daniel Currie Hill, and most of the material I've been able to find was taken from his life history that was written by one of his daughters, Mary Agnes Hill Peterson. And it could be said that Daniel lived his life in two parts, before and after he moved to Wellsville. His early life reflects the struggles and events that many of the early LDS converts went through. As you will discover, Daniel lived most of his life to the fullest, right up to the very end. Daniel was born in April 1807 in Johnston Abbey Parish, Scotland, to Alexander Hill and Elizabeth Currie Hill. The family immigrated to Canada when Daniel was 13 years old, and the family remained in the Lanark Bathurst district for 12 years. While there, Daniel aided his father and brothers in chopping, burning, and clearing away the timber and the underbrush. They were the first settlers in that area, so it was quite a task to dig all that up. It had never been touched by human hands before. They planted their crops around the stumps of the trees they had cut down and would work at removing the stumps when the ground was accessible. This was all done by hand because they didn't own horses or other animals to pull the plows. Over the next few years, they were able to cut down most of the trees and remove all of the stumps and clear the brush and gather the multitude of stones into piles. Eventually, they decided there wasn't enough work there, so they moved to be near Toronto, got into the same type of an area, and they started all over again. Daniel was 26 years old at that time. That year, he met Elizabeth Bryce and married her on March 23, 1833. They began having children and named the first one after his father, Alexander. In 1840, a Mormon missionary came to Toronto to preach the gospel. Soon, many of the locals embraced the message and were baptized, including most of the Alexander Hill family. This included Daniel and Elizabeth and nearly 30 other family members. In September of 1842, the family moved to Nauvoo. For the next 3 years, Daniel spent his time hauling brick for the Nauvoo temple and rocks for the Nauvoo house. Daniel and Elizabeth continued to have children during this time, although some died during infancy. Daniel personally knew the prophet Joseph and spent some time as his bodyguard. Daniel didn't hesitate to tell others of his testimony of Joseph as a true prophet. This belief would cause Daniel much suffering over the years, but he never wavered in his belief. Daniel and his family, along with other saints, were driven from Nauvoo by the mobs and saw their homes burned to the ground. 2 of Daniel's brothers were stripped naked, tied to posts, and whipped bloody. Daniel and his family experienced the miracle of the quails, as it's come to be called. As the saints were starving, a large number of plump birds were seen in the area, so tame that they could be caught by hand. The saints harvested these quails and used them to avoid starvation. In 1846, the first presidency was forced to flee the area because of the persecution heaped upon them. Daniel used his team and horses to help move the personal belongings of the presidency to Garden Grove, Iowa. He nearly starved to death upon his return trip and was in such a sorry condition that his family didn't even recognize him when he got back. A short time later, Daniel and his brother John and their families were among the first company to cross the icy waters of the Mississippi in February of 1846. Daniel and his family next moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where he worked for over a year as a miller. This may have been his first exposure to working in a mill. They then moved to Warsaw, Illinois, where he labored in a stream flour mill for 3 or 4 years. This was a good experience for him and would be a blessing to Wellsville when he later moved here. Daniel was always thrifty and saved his money. This thriftiness would prove to be a blessing both to his family and the town of Wellsville in the future. Other members of the Hill family had already headed west 5 years earlier with the original pioneers in 1847, but Daniel waited until he had sufficient funds to buy traveling teams and a traveling outfit. This allowed his family's trip to be easier and avoid a lot of the hardships of the earlier travelers. It was still a hard trip, but not as bad as it could have been. Daniel arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in the fall of 1853 and settled in the Mill Creek area where his family had earlier settled. He commenced working again as a miller. This was in an area called Gardner Mills, which is near the Highland Drive area nowadays. He continued to work at this mill for 4 years. In 1856, Daniel was called by President Brigham Young to labor in a mill in Brigham City, which he did for 2 years. In 1859, Daniel and his brother John, with 2 of their sons, came to Cache Valley and commenced building a flour mill. This took an entire season, and by the spring of 1860, the first grist mill in Cache Valley was running and grinding flour. He returned to Salt Lake, gathered his family, and they returned to Wellsville, where he settled on the mill site in eastern Wellsville near the banks of the Little Bear River. Daniel was 53 years old at this time, an age when many men were looking at slowing down. Daniel was just getting started with the second phase of his life. Bears were a problem in Cache Valley in the early days. In 1860, Daniel and his brother John were called upon to hunt down and kill a bear, which they did. Later, in August of 1863, there were signs of a bear eating the corn crop in the fields near the grist mill. John and Daniel's son Robert went out one night to see if they could hunt down the bear. At the same time, unknowns to them, another group of 5 or 6 men from Hiram were also in the area trying to track down the bear. Both groups could hardly be seen in the pale moonlight, but they were making a little noise. The Hiram group fired at the noise, which unfortunately was Robert and John. John was hit by several bullets and died almost instantly. Robert's ear was grazed by a bullet, but he was unhurt otherwise. A little over a year later, another man was killed by a large bear, having his neck broken and his head nearly severed from his body. Several men gathered at the site of the killing, including Daniel, and declared they needed to find the bear before it killed again. Daniel led out, and when he entered into the brush, he came upon this 600-pound bear. Unfortunately, he had come between a mother bear and her cubs. The bear raised its paw and swiped at Daniel. The others thought Daniel had also been killed, but the bear had only knocked his hat to the ground. Daniel shoved the muzzle of his gun into the bear's mouth and fired, but it was a misfire. Another man shot over Daniel's shoulder and killed the bear. A bear cub was also killed while another cub ran away. After his brother's death, Daniel became the principal owner of the grist mill until his death in July of 1881. The grist mill was built about 1/2 mile east of the then boundary of Wellsville. This is where the Stars shed now stands at 685 East Main across from Welkin Mart. And I'm sure you've all seen it out there. It was built of heavy timber, hewed by a broad axe. The boards were held together by wooden pegs. On the east side of the mill was a boarded flume which carried the water from the mill race to the penstock on the west side. And if you look, you can still see where the weeds and stuff grow, where that water was run. The original burr stones were obtained from Black Rock, Utah, but proved to be too soft for grinding. So new stones were imported from France. A monument containing the burr stones from the Hill Mill and one other early Cache Valley mill is located near the Logan Tabernacle. Another burr stone is said to be in the possession of Steve Currie here in town. The History of Wellsville history book has a photo and more information about the grist mill, if you were interested in seeing that. In 1872, Wellsville City lacked the necessary funds to pay its bills. The city turned to Daniel Hill and borrowed $40 in 1872 and $60 in 1873. They repaid the loans with interest in 1874. Daniel's habit of thriftiness became a real blessing to Wellsville City. In 1874, Daniel was elected to the city council. Then in 1875, William H. Maughan resigned as mayor to serve an LDS mission. Daniel was chosen to serve out the remainder of the mayor's term, making Daniel the second mayor of Wellsville. He was again elected as mayor the following year. When William H. Maughan returned from his mission, he again ran for mayor in 1880, and Daniel ran for the city council, to which they were both elected. Daniel continued to serve on the city council until his death in 1881. Daniel's personal life was as intriguing as his public one. He provided the funds for many Scottish saints to come to America, both through the Perpetual Immigration Fund and privately. Polygamy was practiced at this time, and Daniel was encouraged by church officials to take a second wife. Daniel provided the funds for a young Swedish convert and her mother to migrate. A short time after their arrival, Daniel married the young woman. Her name was Amelia Malberg, but she was known as Emily. She was 26 at the time, and Daniel was 66. A couple of years later, having learned that a friend's engagement had been terminated because the husband-to-be refused to join the Mormon church, Emily wrote to her friend inquiring if she would be interested in coming to America, where she could be introduced to a fine Mormon man. The woman's name was Frederica Peterson, and she agreed. Daniel sent her funds, and a few months after she arrived, she and Daniel were married in the endowment house in Salt Lake City by Daniel Wells. She was 28 years old at the time, and he was 69. During his childhood, Daniel had 17 siblings. He also had a large family of his own, 16 children, although many died in infancy. With Elizabeth, he had 10 children. With Emily, he had 2, both of which died as infants. And with Frederica, he had 4. Daniel was 26 when his first child was born, and he was 73 when the last one was born, a span of 47 years. It is said the wives got along well with each other, and during the last 12 years of his life, Daniel returned to Canada twice. Once was with Elizabeth to claim her inheritance from her parents' estate. While there, Elizabeth slipped on some ice, injuring her spine, and was never well again. Her spine became crooked, and she slowly began to lose her mind. His second and third wives cared for Elizabeth until they both remarried after Daniel's death. Elizabeth was later declared mentally incompetent, and 2 of Daniel and Elizabeth's daughters-in-law cared for her, and they were the polygamist wives of their son, Daniel Bryce Hill. On July 21st, 1881, Daniel was working on a hay rack going down to a meadow to get a load of hay. Something appeared to be wrong, and Daniel stepped to the front of the horses to check it out. One of the horses reared up and struck Daniel, causing him to fall to the ground. The horses then raced off with the heavy wagon, and it ran over Daniel with both sets of wheels. He lived for about a half hour after this accident, then passed away peacefully without a murmur. Excuse me. And was conscious to the very end. He was 74 years old at the time of his death. Daniel Currie Hill is buried in the Wellsville Cemetery. His wife Elizabeth died in 1885 at the age of 70 and is buried here next to him. His third wife, Frederica, is buried here next to him. And supposedly his second wife, Amelia or Emily, is also buried here, but I haven't been able to find where her grave is yet. Thank you.